guys, welcome back to Repair University. Now, if you watched the first episode, we did kind of a general overview of the agencies that kind of regulate collision repair and what's out there, and it was a lot to soak in. So for this episode, we're coming back and we're covering some of your questions that you sent me online that you wanted to ask specifically about how OSHA and the EPA relate to your collision repair business. So Brandon, are you ready to take the questions?
I'm ready.
I feel like I'm a game show host.
Yeah, lightning round.
All right, so let's start off. What's the average fine that a shop receives when these guys come to visit them?
Per citation that's serious, it's $5,000.
Now, about how many citations? We know it's kind of like what is it, Pringles or whatever. Bet you can't eat just one.
Right.
So how many citations on average does a shop get in a visit?
So this is all public record, and when we see a shop that has gotten a citation, the average is 4.77 citations per visit.
Wow, so that's almost 5 citations at $5,000 a citation. Mm-hmm. That's half of my year operating budget right
Yeah,
there.
I mean, how many cars do you have to fix to recover that?
Wow, that's crazy. All right, so let's move on to, before we get into the refinishing, because most of the questions that we got involved the refinishing division,
Sure.
as you can imagine. But let's talk about body work. So there was some confusion on what are the safety precautions or the regulations that are around the body technician himself. What do they need to be thinking about?
So you've got equipment dealing with typically automotive lifts, jacks, that sort of things, welders, as well as personal protective equipment. So when you're talking about anything that's going to lift something, there has to be some type of load rating. So this is a 2.5-ton jack, or this is a 3-ton jack. It has to be in good condition, so something's not going to spontaneously collapse and they've got their head underneath the vehicle or something like that. A lot of times with the welders, what we'll see is that the regulators, the pressure gauges are damaged or broke or not functioning. Those have to be in working order as well. On the personal protective equipment side, safety glasses is the most obvious one, but there's a lot of confusion around what type of a mask or respirator do I need to be wearing. I see a lot of body technicians that might have just a paper mask, something like a medical mask, right. And that's really for particulates. And it's acceptable in certain repair operations, but it's not adequate if you are doing something like sanding an OE finish to set up a dent or feather edge a dent from where you have Bondo, because it could release isocyanates, and that mask doesn't protect from isocyanates.
Interesting.
When you're welding, you need to actually have a welding or cartridge-based respirator. So the concern is, if you're a body tech, is it better to have multiple masks for multiple different repair operations, and then when you have to swap those out, or to have this is the best mask for the welding and the isocyanates, and I just wear this for everything? So if I wear this the entire day, I know I'm good and I know I'm covered. That's what a lot of businesses are starting to ask of their technicians.
Wow, that's a great point. What sort of gloves? So I get asked a lot whether I'm doing foams or filler or adhesives or whatever through the body process. Does it change between just like a neoprene glove or to a nitrate glove? Does any of that matter for the body technician?
Yeah, it can. I mean, really, you have to look at the documentation. You have to look at the safety data sheets. You have to know what products you're handling. So in certain instances, handling oils, that sort of thing, latex is acceptable. When you get into the seam sealers, typically you're going to need a more sturdier glove, a more chemical-resistant glove, something like a neoprene or a nitrile. So that I can't say one glove is going to work for everything. You just have to know the products that you're handling and coming in contact with, and minimize your exposure to the chemicals as much as possible. I mean, don't be putting it on your hands in the first place.
Right.
Try to keep it on the vehicle or the part that you're repairing.
Right. It's a great point, because I think a lot of times the body man, we kind of make fun of the painters a little bit, that they have all this safety stuff and we're like the cowboys of the body shop. But really, we kind of have almost the same safety standards kind of governing us.
Yeah, actually the body technicians, when we look at the PPE list, they have a larger diversity of equipment, because you also might have a need for some type of electrical resistant glove if they're doing something with a hybrid vehicle or some type of battery. Cut resistant gloves if they're handling sharp metals, as well as chemical resistant gloves. For the paint department, it's just kind of wear the glove and you're good for everything that you do. So the list is longer for body technicians. It's just typically, historically, there really hasn't been much of a concern or an emphasis in that department.
Yeah, I kind of like it as a good rule of thumb. If I'm touching a car in the body process, there's a respirator, eye protection, and gloves probably needed if I want to make sure that I'm 100% compliant and all of that.
Most likely.
That works out. Let's move on a little bit to the painting, because there was a lot of questions about that. And we'll start with a refinish question that kind of takes place in the body stall. So the 3-ounce cup rule, what does that really mean? How many 3-ounce cups can I use? Can I like load 12 3-ounce cups and go to town on a car? What are some of the stipulations around that? Because we've kind of seen that as our get out of jail free card, I
Right.
think.
So this is tied to 6H NESHAP, which is an EPA regulation that came into effect about 5 years ago. And the business owner had one of two paths. They could either file an initial notification of compliance, that they're going to comply with that regulation that's dealing with emissions, or if they are spraying a paint line that doesn't have the chemicals in it that the EPA is worried about, they could file for exemption. And one of the components of that was this 3-ounce cup rule. So if I am filing as compliant, you're limited on the shop floor to a 3-ounce cup. 1 cup. You can't use 6 3-ounce cups sequentially and do a large job and say, well, I stayed within that cup. No, you're defeating the purpose of the regulation, which is we want to minimize the emissions from those particular hazardous air pollutants or HAPs. If you file exempt and your paint line doesn't even have those HAPs or those air pollutants, then you could spray whatever you want on the shop floor from an EPA standpoint. You may have violations from OSHA that are troubling and could be a concern, but from an emission standpoint, they're not there in the first place, so they're not worried about what you're spraying or how much you're spraying in the shop floor.
Let's talk about that OSHA violation, because I've heard some shops kind of get caught on that, where they got so caught up in 6H and feeling like they were compliant with the EPA that the OSHA kind of slipped in on them and they got a little fines there. What is that rule? What is OSHA concerned about when it comes to me spraying 3 ounces on the body shop floor?
Right. So essentially it depends on what's actually in the product, but the focus is the isocyanates. And depending on the paint manufacturer, they could be in hardeners and catalyzers, they could be in primers. Predominantly, they're going to be always found in clear coats. So you really have to engage with either your jobber or distributor or read the documentation of where those occur. Because if your painter is in the habit of doing primer on the shop floor in a 3-ounce cup, may be perfectly acceptable from an EPA standpoint in emissions, but if there are isocyanates in that product and I have a helper that's masking the next car that's not wearing any PPE at all, well, now they're being exposed to those isocyanates, and that's an OSHA violation. We've had instances where the person that's doing the spraying on the shop floor has everything on and is perfect, but there's violations and citations because there's 5 other people in the department that are exposed to those things. They didn't know it because they're odorless, they're tasteless, they don't cause lightheadedness. There's really no trigger for saying, oh, I'm being exposed to isocyanates right now.
Right. While we're on that topic, I think we're going to veer off a little bit of the questions, but you know, I think a lot of us growing up in this business, I mean, my mom went into labor in the paint booth, and Dad had to take, and come out.
I haven't heard that story.
That was when, the fog, we'd close the doors and paint the car, and you couldn't see it after you were done. But a lot of us we didn't understand what an isocyanate was and what it does to us physically and health-wise until we see some of those old body men crawling around and hacking. What's the damaging aspects of an isocyanate to us physically?
So it's a powerful irritant to 2 bodily systems. 1 being respiratory tract, 2 being the mucous membranes. So symptoms are shown in a lot of different ways, but you could have long-term illnesses such as bronchitis, asthmas, bronchospasms, that sort of thing that's affecting the respiratory tract from isocyanate exposure. And you could also have what's known as isocyanate sensitization that occurs with the skin or mucous membranes. Think of it like an allergic reaction. If you're allergic to pet dander, you get around it, you start to wheeze, cough, your eyes water, you might break out into hives. Isocyanates can do the same thing when you're exposed to low levels over a long period of time. And the reality is that most of your audience, this is their careers, this is their livelihood. So every day they're going to be exposed to this. Their body can establish a threshold where, hey, now once you get to this level, you're going to have a bodily reaction to it, and it's not going to go away.
Now let's talk about how we get to isocyanate, because I will say that for me, this was a revelation. I sort of had the misconception that I had to breathe it in to get exposed to it, and I was a big fan of a face mask because I believed that I needed to see what I was painting, I needed to see everything around me. Oh, I don't want a shield and a fresh air suit. And then I got a lesson to actually how my body gets them, and I can get them through the eyes and I can get them through my skin. Is that a real concern that a painter who's just used to a face mask needs to be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we tend to think that our skin is a tough, thick layer or barrier for our bodies, and the reality is that it's a 2-way street. When it gets hot out and we produce moisture, it seeps out of our pores. You put chemicals such as isocyanates or thinners or gun cleaners or oils or whatever it is onto your skin, that's going to be absorbed into your bloodstream and into your body. So a lot of times we see painters that are very good about personal protective equipment, respiratory protection in the booth, but when they're mixing paint and they're handling it, if you go into a mixer room and there's paint on the scale, the bench, the door, the cans, the garbage can, it's everywhere, or when they're cleaning their gun, that uncured paint still has isocyanates in it, could be exposed, could be drawn into the body and create those health hazards.
That brings in a really importance to our paint suit So I get all my paint suits from Sada, and I'm kind of trusting, you know, Sada never steers me wrong. But there are some suits out there that do prevent isocyanates, and then there are some cheaper suits out there that don't. And if a shop's got the wrong suit, well, that's a violation as well.
Correct. I mean, OSHA is going to say it's up to the employer to decide what are you going to require of your employees to wear. And if you say, well, I'm just going to get a coverall or a suit, and they're all kind of the same, that's not actually the case. If you talk to the manufacturers or the jobbers and you look at the different offerings from something like a Sada, there are ISO suits, and then there are just the regular coveralls that are more to keep your clothing clean. And the function of the suit in our type of environment, or our industry, is not to protect clothing, it's to protect the isocyanates from getting into our bodies.
Right. And I want to make sure that we drive this point home. I never really understood what I was exposing myself to, and I think a lot of us, we get a little training on it, but we kind of don't take it all that seriously. But if you're not spraying with a paint suit, including head protection, fresh air, protecting your eyes as well as you are your skin, well, you're exposing yourself to some harmful chemicals. So maybe if you're in the booth all day, I really encourage you to rethink what you're looking at for your personal protection, whether your employer requires it or not, because the long end of this business is, well, I'd like to retire one day.
Sure.
And not be crippled or on oxygen and ragging my tank
Sure.
around talking about the good old days.
Absolutely.
All right, now, Brandon, before we get off kind of the respiratory and the facial protections and parts of refinishing, let's talk about those cartridges. How frequently should I be changing the cartridges on my respirator?
So as much as I hate to say it, it depends on the work environment. What a business owner has to do is what's known as called a vapor air monitoring test. Essentially, it's a little button that a painter will wear on their collar for an entire day, because the chemical concentration in the ambient environment, air movement, relative humidity, what they're doing, how much they're spraying, all of those things are variables that are going to affect the shelf life of those cartridge filters. So if you haven't done the research, you really don't know, is it 2 weeks, is it 3 weeks, is it 1 week? You do that test, now you know in that environment I have to change these out every 2 weeks or every week. That's the key step. But by and large, what we typically see when we look at these tests is about every 2 weeks.
It's definitely not something you're going to be able to tell
No.
when it's time, and you're not going to be able to see it.
Right.
So,
and OSHA's not going to accept, well, everyone else does it for 2 weeks, so why can't I? You have to make the actual research and the effort to make that determination.
mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about, there's a topic that got a lot of attention, mostly last year, a little bit into the first of this year, and it's spontaneous combustion. And I know it sounds like something scientific or an episode of CSI or whatever, but we did have 2 incidents this year that took the life of 2 painters in 2 separate states.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about spontaneous combustion, how that happens, and what the painters or the detail and prepper guys can do to prevent that real hazard.
Yeah, so it's something when we do training classes all over the country, I ask the technicians, how many have been involved in a body shop fire? You know, not a vehicle that caught on fire from welding or something like that, but a legitimate, the paint department or something like that is catching on fire. And it's something that a lot of people say they've never been exposed to. And so we get a little lax, we get a little bit comfortable with the materials that were around. And the reality is that these type of chemicals are extremely flammable, and we're dealing with air vapors. That's the important thing. The technicians tend to think that, oh, it's the liquid that's burning. So if there's not flammable liquids laying around that can catch a spark or something like that, I don't have to worry about it. And the reality is that it's actually the vapors that burn. So if you have an area that has very poor ventilation, if you aren't keeping up to date on your mix room filter changeouts and your exhaust systems, or your guys are just leaving the door open to try to exhaust that room, you have a very high level of vapor pressure in there that's flammable. And if someone was to scuff something to where you could have a little bit of static electricity and you can create that combustion, if someone was to light a torch somewhere nearby, light a cigarette, doing really anything that could create that spark, the vapors is what catches on fire, and then it travels to wherever that source of those vapors are. So in the shop, when we walk through, the big thing for us is how is it laid out? What kind of air movement do we have? If we have a lot of flammable storage, it's in a dark closet, there's really no air movement in there, there's nothing for them to escape and kind of filter out or disperse, that could be a potential hazard. If you have outlets, lights, electrical panels, any type of electrical wiring, that sort of thing could create that
Right,
combustion.
I see as I travel around these mix rooms, some of them are great and fancy and wonderful new mix rooms, and they're made by great manufacturers. And some of them are the old style mix rooms, and the painter's got a radio, and he's got his Bluetooth wireless speaker, and he's got all this stuff in the mixing room for him. And all of that's putting in electricity, and that's a potential explosion, basically, is what happens.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is every time you plug something in, an electrical reaction takes place. There's some type of a spark that begins that electrical reaction. So if you have things like a radio, or a lot of times in the southern markets, we see air conditioners just because it gets so hot down here that, you know, you're standing next to a booth all day at 120, 125 degrees. It's going to be a miserable experience for 8 or 9 hours, so they set those up. But anything that could be plugged in is creating some type of electrical reaction, and if it's in a flammable area, it could lead to combustion. It's just, again, we don't see it as a regular thing, so when it does happen, it really surprises us, but the reality is the things that we're exposed to are very, very flammable.
Yeah, and the thing about it is that when it does happen, it's not just a small fire and let's put it out. In these cases, it took the life of 2 painters, and those combustions are real, and they're like little miniature explosions, and it's a hardship, you know, completely on the family. So.
Yeah, and I've actually, when I was on the shop side, I had a paint department burned down, and I was on site when it happened, and I had been through fire training. I had known how to use an extinguisher. I knew don't scream and run. Everyone panics because it burns so fast and so black, you don't have time to react. So you have to take the steps as a preventative measure, not to increase your hazards, not to increase your risk, because when it does happen, if it occurs, you're not going to be able to just grab an extinguisher and put out a booth that's on fire because it goes so quickly.
Right. Let's talk about paint guns. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk lately with 6H coming along that we had to have approved paint guns. The body shop does the paperwork that says the painter has all these paint guns. And it brings up a lot of questions of, I've got some really old guns that I love. My SATA NR 2000, I think cold dead hands. You know, I'll go with the NRA slogan before you're going to take that thing away from me. But it brings up some great questions. If I'm in a facility that's filled out all this paperwork, that's 6H compliant, et cetera, can I use those old guns that are before all these rulings and before all the validation that the EPA gave to the guns?
Short answer is no. So if the business files as we're going to be compliant with that 6H and ESHEP regulation, then the EPA says you can only have these types of guns. So they're looking at you know, transfer ratios, that sort of thing, HVLP. The other ones are removed. Now, if that business is exempt, whether that's because of the type of chemicals that they're exposed to, they don't have the hazardous air pollutants in them, then you can use whatever you want to use.
All right, so you heard that, guys. I'm just like you. I've got some guns that I will never, ever part with. I'm still carrying around a Binks that my dad had from the 70s. But if I'm going to be working in a collision repair facility and I'm going to be talking to that owner, I want to know what the owner's filed for, what status we're in, and whether or not I can or can't use those guns. And then in those cases, well, then I'll just spray those 4,000s that I got. Hopefully I'll get my 5,000 approvals pretty soon. I'll be spraying those soon. So what are some other issues? I know I get a lot of questions on grounding. You know, grounding my containers and what is a proper ground. And I get some people that go, well, what do you mean I have to ground my containers?
Right.
How's that work in the mixing areas?
So this is dealing with flammable liquids and metal containers that are 5 gallons or larger. So when we look at a body shop environment, we're talking about typically a 55-gallon, maybe a 30 of paint waste, and then the 5-gallon containers of virgin thinner. And so the problem is that if you have a funnel attached to a drum of waste and a pump that's attached to your virgin thinner, you've got moving liquids. And moving liquids without any way of discharging the electricity that builds up in it could combust, which just goes back to your earlier question. So we ground those containers and those accessories, those attachments, to discharge that static electricity that builds. So when we look at a shop, we're talking about paint department typically is all where you'll see it. If I have a 55-gallon drum of solvent liquid paint waste with a metal funnel attached to it, I'm grounding in 2 places, the funnel itself and the drum. If I have any size virgin thinner that's 5 gallons or larger, I need to ground that drum, and then if I've attached a pump to it, I need to ground that metal pump as well.
Nice, that's something I know that I very rarely see, and you probably rarely see that too in your visits where we're actually getting everything grounded properly. We're kind of struggling still just to handle the waste and get it disposed of.
Right.
All right, so we've covered kind of the mixing it, we've covered the spraying it. One of the questions I get a lot is, when exactly does it go from paint to waste? Because the rules change as soon as it's waste.
Yeah, so essentially the straight answer is when your process is finished. So if you have 2 ounces left in a PPS liner and you know you have a similar color card that's coming in soon, you want to use that for a ground coat or you're going to use it for touch-ups, then it's still a part of your process. But once you've decided or your painters have decided this is no longer going to be used, it's time to dispose of it, that's when it becomes a waste and the different rules come into play.
All right. Now, we've all had some, I think there's probably every shop out there that's gotten at least hit by a trash can violation. So you see that a lot. What's the problem about when it hits the trash can, and what can hit the trash can and what can't?
Yeah, so in the paint department, we've got a lot of misconceptions out there. Well, it's dry paint or it's hard paint, so it's okay, it's safe, or it's water-based paint, so it can be mixed with kitty litter and then thrown away, or the distillate that comes out of the thinner recycler machines, that can go in there because all the solvents have evaporated. None of that is necessarily true. The EPA's rule of thumb is going to be, okay, if you're putting it into the trash, how do you know those chemicals aren't there? What testing have you done? What laboratories have you worked with doing what's called a T-clip, where you're looking at the metals, the ignitability, the solvents that could still be there before you put that into the trash? Just saying, well, it cooked everything away, or well, it's water-based paint, or well, none of that means anything to the EPA. So rule of thumb is this. When you have leftover paint in a PPS liner, for instance, if you're using a PPS system, if I can invert that liner and still have paint shake out of it, that can't yet go in the trash. You have to get it down to less than 2% of the total container size before it's safe to go into the trash. Same thing with your pints and quarts. If you have some leftover paint, that has to be poured out into the liquid paint waste drum, and then it can go into a dumpster. Now, that's not every part of the country, because some part, like California, they have different rules with metal cans and things like that. But general rule of thumb across the country, if there's something that can be poured or flow through, that's got to go into a waste container before it goes into the trash. And hard paint, dried paint, does not mean that it can just go into the trash. There has to be either documentation or it has to be disposed of by a hazardous waste hauler.
What about paint on rags or stir sticks or any of that? What are the rules there?
So same thing. If I have an absorbent pad that is, your booth filters are probably the best example of that. Those have to be disposed of as hazardous waste by a hazardous waste hauler unless you've done what's known as the T-clip, where you've sent them to a lab, you've cut off like an 8-inch by 8-inch piece of saturated floor filter, if it's a downdraft booth, send it into a lab, they test it and say, all the solvents are gone, this is non-hazardous, you can throw it into the landfill or the dumpster. So it just depends on the waste and what type of documentation you've put together to show, I know these chemicals aren't there. And it's not just because I know it, it's because I've done the work to prove it.
So it's better to probably just go on the safety side if I was a shop owner and just make sure I'm not leaving anything to chance or to the opinion of the painter.
Yeah, and we've done thousands of filter testings through labs, and 98% of the time they come back non-hazardous. But you also don't want to say, well, Brandon said on Collision Hub 90% of the time, so therefore it's okay, because that's not going to free you of liability from a regulatory agency.
Yeah, I don't see an EPA agent being really happy with it.
Right.
Yeah. Who said what?
Right.
That'd be awesome. While we're on the topic of the PPS liners, it's a pet peeve of mine, and I get it. I've saved a couple of ground coats, but for the most part, I go in a shop and I open the door, and it's like the PPS cups fall out.
Mm-hmm.
What are the regulations for what I can keep, how I keep it?
Sure.
Besides, we know that some of that's just not a good idea. After a certain time, let it go. Just let it go. That car's not coming back, and that color shifting, and the hardeners and everything setting up. But what are the rules for storing those cups? So
a couple things from an EPA OSHA standpoint, they have to be closed. That's first and foremost. Second, they all have to be labeled, and it's not easy to label a PPS liner to begin with. And labeling it with, well, this is yellow or this is this car, is not labeling the contents, the manufacturer, and the hazards. So typically that's very difficult for a shop to do. You're also, from an OSHA standpoint, allowed 1 day of inventory to be outside, when you're dealing with flammable materials, outside of either a sprinkled area, like a mix room, or a flammable cabinet. So if you're a shop that paints 6 cars a day, you can do the math in terms of how many liners you can have outside of one of those cabinets based on primer, base, and clear. Typically, when we go into shops and there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these liners, if they are not in a flammable cabinet or they are not in the mix room, then you have violations there as well. So there's a couple different ways that a shop can have some problems there.
Right. It gets kind of sad. They start to crumble, and you see the caps kind of going sideways, and it's like the cups are melting, and you just want to grab the painter and go, it's okay to let it go.
Right. But just remember when you're getting rid of that you're pouring that into the waste container. You're not just throwing the liner away.
Right, not just throwing those away. Yeah. Brandon, is there anything we haven't covered today that would be really important for whether a technician or the shop owner to know?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to touch on was just the supplied air systems. When we talk about fresh air, there's some misconceptions out there of whether or not it's required, whether OSHA wants to see it and whatnot. And from a business owner perspective, there isn't a mandate that says you have to do fresh air. Really, it's going to say, can you get by with respiratory protection, like a half-face piece, that sort of thing, by doing the documentation, the air monitoring, the change-out schedules, all the other things that have to go along with respirators. But from a business standpoint, from a technician standpoint, the key thing for me is isocyanates are not tasteless. There's no odor to them. They don't cause dizziness. They don't cause lightheadedness. So if I'm using a half face piece mask with a cartridge, and I normally change out every 2 weeks, there's really no way for me to know if that filter is protecting me from isocyanates. Certainly other chemicals, but not isocyanates. And if I'm not documenting when I'm changing them out, if I'm not putting them in sealed containers when they're not being used, then I'm going to make that shelf life even less. And you have no trigger. You could be exposing yourself to hazardous chemicals and not be aware of it. So fresh air is a great solution to eliminate all of that. And if you have it in your shops and you're not using it because you don't prefer the comfort or the fit, I really, really encourage you to reevaluate that, because isocyanates could be a big looming health hazard for our industry 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Right. Brandon, before we kind of end this and go out, I've been fascinated with the service that you guys offer, and especially recently with the TV shows as we're trying to figure out our violations and fines.
Sure.
But you guys do just about everything for the shop for, I want to say, pennies compared to a $5,000 violation. Explain a little bit about what Envirosafe does and the services that you guys offer.
So our service is called the Compliance Department, and the idea is that collision repair organizations, you have your estimating department, your refinish department, your metal department, that sort of thing. Typically there isn't a lot of focus on how do we deal with these issues. So we are an outsourcing solution where we provide you a fully staffed, resourced compliance department for your business. So our goal is to work with your technicians directly, do training classes, put you through your paces on an audit, identify ways that we can improve, handle your paperwork, your filing, your safety data sheet libraries, anything that falls under that OSHA, EPA umbrella, environmental and employee safety. We're going to try to take that off of the shop owner's responsibility on a day-to-day level and communicate with the staff that's there so that they can improve their business and protect themselves from injury, citation, liability, penalty, all of the above.
All right, so nuts and bolts. What's that generally run a shop owner? Because it's amazing. It's a great service. I'd love not to have to do paperwork. I hate doing paperwork. Now, what's that kind of run?
So we have a couple different options that are scaled based on organization size. So for a smaller organization, we have kind of a DIY approach where we give you all the materials and the expertise and whatnot. That's $49 per month. And then our Cadillac service, where we're going to come out 4 times a year, we're going to do in-person training classes, that sort of thing, is $199 a month.
Man, that's kind of like a no-brainer. You know, for me to be able to spend what is comparable a small amount when I think about what I'm spending on my software and some other things in my shop, to know that I'm not going to have a surprise from the EPA and OSHA, that would be great, because just in the short time today, I think we've all learned something about what we can and can't do. So be sure that you're checking all of your compliance issues for OSHA, EPA, and your fire marshals. Make sure that you get all your questions answered, and that not only that you as the shop owner know or as the technician know, but that the two of y'all are communicating together to make sure that the shop is in the right position for when they come knocking on their door. Because it's not a matter of if they're coming, well, it's just a matter of when and how much is it going to cost us, right? Since they say they never leave without a violation. So if you want more information on Envirosafe and what they can do for your business, you can find it here on the website. Give us a call and we will get you in touch with them. Or you can visit their website, which we'll put up here for you to review and get more information. But I promise you, it's probably the best thing that you're ever going to do for your facility. Stay tuned for more Repair University. We're going to be back as we go to Las Vegas for SEMA 2014. We're going to be bringing you lots of new equipment, new training, new products, and we're even going to bring you some new safety equipment. Thanks.